Hey there, you're looking kind of cute. Don't forget to subscribe and check out all my other socials. Enjoy. The taxi pulled up to a modest two-story house with faded blue paint and a slightly overgrown lawn. Valerie took a deep breath, her hand hovering over the door handle. She'd been dreading and anticipating this moment in equal measure for weeks. Stepping out onto the cracked driveway, memories flooded back. Playing catch with her father, learning to ride a bike, helping him wash the car on lazy Sunday afternoons. But those were memories of a different person, a different life. She smoothed down her floral sundress and ran a hand through her long chestnut hair, steeling herself. The front door creaked open before she reached it. There he stood, her father, looking smaller and frailer than she remembered. His salt and pepper hair had gone mostly gray, and deep lines etched his face. But his eyes, those warm brown eyes she'd inherited, lit up with recognition. Valerie, he said, his voice catching. You made it. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak just yet. They stood there for a long moment, the weight of years and unspoken words hanging between them. Finally, her father stepped back. Well, come on in. No sense standing out here all day. Valerie followed him inside, taking in the familiar sights and smells. The house looked mostly the same, maybe a bit more cluttered, a few more cobwebs in the corners. Family photos lined the walls, but she noticed with a pang that the more recent ones were conspicuously absent. Her father settled heavily into his worn armchair, gesturing for Valerie to take a seat on the couch. Can I get you anything? Water? Coffee? She shook her head. I'm fine, thanks. She perched on the edge of the couch, hands folded in her lap. How are you feeling, Dad? The doctors said... He waved a hand dismissively. What do they know? I'm still kicking. A wheezing cough belied his words. But enough about that. Tell me about you. How's everything? Valerie smiled softly. It's good, Dad. Really good. I'm happy. Her father nodded slowly, his eyes roaming over her face. You look... different. But your eyes, they're the same. Yeah, Valerie said, her throat tight. Some things don't change. They lapsed into silence again, the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner, marking the passage of time. I've been going through some old things, her father said suddenly. Found some photo albums I thought you might like to see. He heaved himself out of the chair with a grunt and shuffled over to a bookshelf. Valerie watched him, noting the stiffness in his movements, the slight tremor in his hands as he pulled down a dusty album. Here we go, he said, settling back into his chair. He patted the spot next to him, and Valerie moved to sit on the arm of the chair. He opened the album, and Valerie's breath caught. There she was, or rather, there he was. A tow-headed little boy with skinned knees and a gap-toothed grin, proudly holding up a small fish. Your first catch? Her father said, his voice warm with nostalgia. You were so excited, you insisted on sleeping with that fishing rod for a week. Valerie laughed softly. I'd forgotten about that. They paged through the album together, reliving moments frozen in time. Birthday parties, little league games, family vacations. With each photo, Valerie felt the knot in her chest loosening slightly. Her father paused on a picture of a lanky teenager in an ill-fitting suit, looking uncomfortable at what appeared to be a school dance. Your first homecoming, he said. You didn't want to go, remember? Said dances were stupid. Valerie nodded, a lump forming in her throat. I remember. Her father's finger traced the edge of the photo. I always wondered, was it because... He trailed off, unable to finish the question. Valerie took a deep breath. Partly, she admitted. I never felt comfortable in situations like that. It always felt wrong somehow, like I was playing a part in someone else's story. Her father was quiet for a long moment. Then, hesitantly, he reached out and took her hand. His palm was rough and weathered against her smoother skin. I'm sorry, he said softly. I wish I'd known that I could have helped somehow. Valerie squeezed his hand. You couldn't have known, Dad. I didn't even know myself, not really. Not for a long time. He nodded, his eyes glistening. You're happy now, though? Truly? I am, Valerie said, and she meant it. For the first time in my life, I feel whole. Her father cleared his throat gruffly. Well, that's what matters, I suppose. They spent the rest of the afternoon looking through old photos and mementos, sharing stories and memories. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the living room, Valerie realized with a start how much time had passed. I should probably get going, she said reluctantly. I promised some old friends I'd meet them for drinks tonight. Her father nodded, struggling to his feet. Of course. Don't let your old man keep you. Valerie helped him up, struck again by how frail he seemed. On impulse, she pulled him into a hug. After a moment's hesitation, his arms came around her, holding her tight. I'm glad you came, he murmured. Me too, Dad, Valerie said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. I'll come back tomorrow, okay? He nodded as they separated. I'd like that. As Valerie gathered her things, her father cleared his throat. Val? She turned. Yeah? He seemed to be struggling to find the right words. Finally, he said simply, You look beautiful, sweetheart. Tears pricked at Valerie's eyes. Thanks, Dad, she whispered. The walk into town was both familiar and strange. The same winding streets, the same old buildings, but everything seemed smaller, somehow quainter. Valerie found herself hyper-aware of the curious glances from passers-by. This was a small town, after all. News traveled fast. She pushed open the door to O'Malley's, the local pub where she'd agreed to meet her old classmates. The interior was dim and smoky, smelling of stale beer and decades of spilled drinks ground into the floorboards. A few heads turned as she entered, conversation stuttering to a halt before resuming in hushed tones. Valerie scanned the room, her heart pounding. Then she saw him, Mike Donovan, sitting alone at the bar. He'd filled out since high school, his lanky frame now solid and muscular, but his shock of red hair was unmistakable. Taking a deep breath, Valerie approached. Is this seat taken? Mike looked up, confusion flickering across his face before recognition dawned. His eyes widened. Valerie? She nodded, sliding onto the bar stool next to him. Hey, Mike, it's been a while. He let out a low whistle. Yeah, you could say that. Wow, you look different. Valerie couldn't help but laugh. That's one way of putting it. Mike grinned sheepishly. Sorry, I'm just processing, I guess. Last I heard, you were off in the big city. Didn't expect to see you back here, especially not... He gestured vaguely at her. Like this? Valerie supplied. She signaled the bartender. Whiskey neat, please. Mike raised an eyebrow. Some things haven't changed, I see. What can I say? Old habits die hard. They fell into an awkward silence as the bartender set Valerie's drink in front of her. She took a sip, savoring the burn. So, Mike said finally, how have you been? Valerie considered the question. Good, she said. Really good, actually. You? He shrugged. Can't complain. Got married a few years back, got a kid on the way. Congratulations, Valerie said sincerely. That's great, Mike. He nodded, fiddling with his beer bottle. Thanks, it's pretty exciting. He cleared his throat. Listen, Val, I just want to say, I'm sorry if I ever, back in school, if I ever said anything or did anything that... Valerie held up a hand. Mike, it's okay, we were kids. None of us knew any better. He looked relieved. Still, I'm glad you're happy now. You deserve it. They clinked glasses, the awkwardness slowly melting away as they caught up on the years that had passed. Mike filled her in on the local gossip, who'd gotten married, who'd left town, who'd come back. Valerie shared sanitized versions of her life in the city, her transition relegated to vague comments about finding herself. As the night wore on and the drinks flowed, Valerie found herself relaxing. The curious stares from other patrons had mostly subsided, and the familiar banter with Mike felt normal, like old times, but better somehow. Remember prom night? Mike said, his words slightly slurred. When we spiked the punch and Principal Hawkins caught us? Valerie groaned, laughing. God, I thought he was going to have an aneurysm. His face turned so red. Mike chuckled. Yeah, and then you talked us out of it somehow. Always were good with words. It's a gift, Valerie said with a mock bow. Mike's expression turned thoughtful. You know, I always admired that about you. Even back then, you always seemed so sure of yourself, like you knew who you were. Valerie's smile faded slightly. Looks can be deceiving, she said softly. Mike studied her for a long moment. Yeah, he said finally. I guess they can be. The bartender called out for last call, startling them both. Valerie glanced at her watch, surprised to see how late it had gotten. I should probably head out, she said, fishing for her wallet. I promised my dad I'd come by again tomorrow. Mike nodded, throwing some bills on the bar. Let me walk you. It's late. They stepped out into the cool night air, the streets mostly deserted. As they walked in companionable silence, Valerie found herself stealing glances at Mike. In another life, maybe? But no, that wasn't her life, not anymore. They reached the corner where their paths diverged. Mike hesitated, then pulled Valerie into a brief, slightly awkward hug. It was good to see you, Val, he said. Really good. Valerie smiled. You too, Mike. Take care of yourself, okay? He nodded, shoving his hands in his pockets. You too. And hey, don't be a stranger, all right? This town could use a little shaking up now and then. Valerie laughed. I'll keep that in mind. As she watched Mike's retreating form, Valerie felt a mix of emotions wash over her. Nostalgia, yes, but also a sense of closure, of one chapter ending and another beginning. She turned and headed back towards her childhood home, where her father waited. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new conversations. But for now, she was content. She was Valerie, finally and truly herself, walking the streets of her hometown with her head held high. The next morning dawned bright and clear, sunlight streaming through the thin curtains of Valerie's old bedroom. She blinked awake, momentarily disoriented by the familiar yet strange surroundings. Posters of long-forgotten bands still adorned the walls, interspersed with faded ribbons from track meets and academic competitions. Valerie sat up, running a hand through her sleep-mussed hair. The events of the previous day came flooding back. The emotional reunion with her father, the unexpected night out with Mike. She felt a mix of anticipation and trepidation about what this new day might bring. After a quick shower, she stood in front of the mirror, carefully applying her makeup. It was a ritual that still held a hint of novelty, even after all this time. Each stroke of mascara, each swipe of lipstick, was an affirmation of her true self. Dressed in a light sweater and jeans, Valerie made her way downstairs. The smell of coffee and bacon greeted her, along with the sound of her father puttering around in the kitchen. She paused in the doorway, watching him for a moment. He looked up, a hesitant smile crossing his face. Morning, he said. I wasn't sure what you liked for breakfast these days, but I remembered you always used to love my bacon and eggs. Valerie felt a lump form in her throat. That sounds perfect, Dad. Thanks. They ate in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the clink of forks against plates and the rustle of her father's newspaper. Finally, he cleared his throat. So how was your night out? See anyone you knew? Valerie nodded, swallowing a mouthful of eggs. Yeah, actually, I ran into Mike Donovan at O'Malley's. Her father's eyebrows rose. Mike, huh? How's he doing? Good, Valerie said. Married now, baby on the way. Well, good for him, her father said. He hesitated, then added, and how did he react to, Valerie understood the unspoken question. It was a little awkward at first, she admitted, but overall it went better than I expected. We had a nice time catching up. Her father nodded slowly. That's good. I'm glad. He folded his newspaper, setting it aside. Listen, Val, I've been thinking. There are some things I'd like to show you if you're up for it. Curiosity piqued, Valerie nodded. Of course. After breakfast, her father led her out to the garage. It was cluttered with the usual detritus of suburban life: old bicycles, boxes of holiday decorations, tools hanging on pegboards. But in the corner, partially covered by a tarp, was something Valerie hadn't seen in years. Her father pulled back the tarp, revealing a classic Mustang in various states of disrepair. "Remember this?" he asked. Valerie's eyes widened. "The project car," she breathed. "I can't believe you still have it." Her father ran a hand along the car's fender. "We never did finish restoring it, did we? Life got in the way, I guess." Valerie remembered countless weekends spent in this garage, learning the intricacies of engines and bodywork. It had been one of the few activities where she'd felt truly connected to her father, even as she struggled with her identity. "I thought," her father said hesitantly, "maybe we could work on it a bit. While you're here, if you want." Valerie felt tears prick at her eyes. "I'd like that, Dad. I'd like that a lot." They spent the next few hours tinkering with the car, falling into an easy rhythm. Her father showed her what he'd done in her absence, and together they made plans for the work that still needed to be done. As they worked, they talked about Valerie's life in the city, about her father's health, about the years they'd lost. "I'm sorry," her father said, as she said at one point, his voice gruff with emotion, "for not understanding sooner, for not being there for you when you needed me." Valerie put down the wrench she was holding and turned to face him. "Dad, it's okay. It wasn't easy for either of us, but we're here now, right?" He nodded, blinking rapidly. "We are, and I'm proud of you, Val, for having the courage to be who you really are." They hugged then, the scent of motor oil and metal surrounding them. It wasn't perfect, Valerie knew. There were still conversations to be had, bridges to be mended, but it was a start. As the afternoon wore on, Valerie's phone buzzed with a text from Mike. "Hey, a bunch of us are getting together at the old quarry tonight. Bonfire, beers, like old times. Wanna join?" Valerie hesitated, her thumb hovering over the screen. Part of her wanted to say no, to stay in this bubble with her father. But another part yearned for connection, for the chance to reclaim a piece of her past on her own terms. "Everything okay?" her father asked, noticing her distraction. Valerie explained the invitation. To her surprise, her father nodded encouragingly. "You should go," he said. "It'll do you good to see your old friends." "Are you sure?" Valerie asked. "I don't want to leave you alone." He waved a hand dismissively. "I'm not going anywhere. Go, have fun, be young." Valerie smiled, feeling a surge of affection for this man who was trying so hard to understand and support her. "Okay," she said, "but I'm coming back tomorrow. We've got a car to finish, after all." As the sun began to set, Valerie found herself bumping down the old dirt road that led to the quarry. The familiar landscape brought back a flood of memories. Illicit parties, late-night swims, fumbling first kisses. She parked next to a cluster of other vehicles and made her way towards the glow of the bonfire. As she approached, she could hear laughter and the strains of music from a portable speaker. Mike spotted her first, raising a beer in greeting. "Val, you made it." Conversation stuttered to a halt as heads turned in her direction. Valerie felt a moment of panic, wondering if she'd made a mistake in coming. But then Sarah Chen, her old lab partner, broke away from the group and enveloped her in a hug. "Oh my God, Val, look at you," Sarah exclaimed. "You look amazing." The ice broken, others came forward to greet her. There were awkward moments, to be sure. Pronouns fumbled, old names quickly corrected. But overall, Valerie was touched by the warmth of her reception. As the night wore on, she found herself settling into the familiar rhythms of these old friendships. They swapped stories of their lives since high school, laughed over shared memories, and speculated about the futures of those who hadn't made it back for this impromptu reunion. At one point, Valerie found herself sitting on a log next to Mike, both of them staring into the flames of the bonfire. "I'm glad you came," Mike said quietly. "It wouldn't have felt right without you here." Valerie smiled, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "Thanks, Mike. I'm glad I came too." They clinked beer bottles, a comfortable silence falling between them. Valerie looked around at the faces illuminated by the firelight. Friends she'd known since childhood, now adults with lives and families of their own. She felt a sense of belonging she hadn't expected, a realization that her transition hadn't erased her history or her connections to this place and these people. As the fire began to die down and people started to drift towards their cars, Valerie found herself lingering. Mike approached, hands shoved in his pockets. "Need a ride?" he asked. Thanks for watching. The rest won't be viewable on YouTube, so check out Patreon if you want more. I hope you have a wonderful day, my cutie.